Good day, everyone. My name is Wapnick, and today we will be discussing the different manifestations of ergativity, such as tense aspects based split ergativity, person animacy based split ergativity, and split intransitive systems, and how all of those systems can evolve in your very own Conlang. Now, before this video starts, I assume that you have already watched part 1 because in this video, there's going to be a lot of linguistic-y terminology that we covered in that episode. So, without a further ado, enjoy the video. Tense aspect split ergativity. Many languages will display ergative patterns in one tensor aspect paradigm and accusative ones in another tensor aspect paradigm. In languages with these systems, past, perfect, and perfective paradigms almost always will display ergative or unaccusative patterns, while non-past and non-perfective paradigms usually display accusative or unergative patterns. Take Kashmiri for an example. In the present progressive paradigm, we see a neutral form of alignment where arguments are not marked for their roles in a given clause. However, in the past paradigm, we can see an ergative pattern with subjects and patients unmarked in the absolutive case and agents marked in the ergative case. We see a similar sort of system in Hindi, where in our non-perfective paradigms we have a neutral form of alignment, and in perfective ones we have ergative alignment. Interestingly, Hindi and many other Indo-Aryan languages are developing a form of direct object marking under certain environments. This has resulted in tripartite alignment in certain clauses, where the subject, agent, and patient are all treated differently. So, you may be asking, how can these systems evolve? Well, let's take our sample language. Perhaps in the proto-language, the speakers of this language decide to evolve some form of direct object marking. This may manifest in the form of an accusative case that marks the patients of transitive active clauses. Well, what were to happen if we used a passive construction? Well, maybe like our first example, the patient, which is now the subject, gets fronted, and the agent, which is now an oblique or adpositional phrase, gets placed behind the verb and is marked with an instrumental case. What if our speakers, this time, decide to mark passivization on the verb, perhaps with a little suffix? Maybe, over time, our instrumental case evolves into an ergative case, and everything moves back around to fit the default SOV word order. Now, maybe interestingly, our marked passive on the verb will slowly evolve into a perfect or past tense. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, we can see that in our non-past paradigm, we see a nominative accusative pattern where we have the subject and agent being treated the same and a marked patient, while in our past paradigm, we can see that we have an ergative absolutive alignment where our subject and patient are being treated the same and where we have a marked agent. Voila! Tense aspect based ergativity. Person animacy based split ergativity. Languages with these systems will tend to display ergative or unaccusative patterns in some nouns and accusative or unergative patterns in other nouns. Silverstein, Delancey, and many others have proposed a person animacy hierarchy to show which nouns are more likely to be treated ergatively or accusatively. First or second person nouns, also known as speech act participants, in all attested cases with these systems are treated accusatively, while inanimate nouns and often all third-person nouns are treated ergatively. In other words, according to Dixon, elements higher on this hierarchy or towards the right end of the spectrum are more likely to be agents, while elements to the lower end of the hierarchy or to the left end of the spectrum are more likely to be patients. Many languages will have different variations on this system, but most will at least roughly fit this hierarchy. Let's take a look at some examples. In Kham, in first and second person pronouns, we see an accusative pattern with subjects and agents being treated the same and patients being marked in an objective case. The accusative pattern is highlighted here in blue. However, all third-person pronouns and other nouns are treated ergatively. Now, notice how just the third-person nouns are treated ergatively, while first and second-person pronouns are still always treated accusatively. This leads to some fun constructions when persons are mixed. As seen in this example, we have our third-person noun and ergative patterns highlighted in red, while we see our accusative patterns with our first and second-person pronouns highlighted in blue. A similar pattern is seen in Marangy, where all pronouns will inflect for an accusative pattern, while all just standard nouns will inflect for an ergative pattern. So, how can this evolve in a Conlang? Well, I will walk you through two possible variations on these systems. First, let's make a system where first and second persons follow an accusative pattern, where third persons follow an ergative pattern. Let's take out our sample language again. Maybe, in the proto-language, our speakers will devise some form of accusative case or direct object marking. Perhaps the speakers will become very used to first and second persons becoming the agents of transitive sentence, while third-person nouns are more likely to be patients. Since our speakers are so used to having first and second persons as agents and third-person nouns as patients, maybe third-person patients won't take any direct object marking at all, since it can be inferred that the third-person nouns are patients. This is a phenomenon known as differential object marking, where direct objects may be unmarked in one situation and marked in another, depending on a number of factors like salience, animacy, definiteness, and sometimes person. Now, what if we had a third-person agent? Well, we might just be tempted to put it before the patient, but remember, our speakers are used to third-person nouns being patients, so this construction may be considered grammatically incorrect. Many languages, like Navajo, will prevent the less salient or animate nouns coming before more salient ones, and the only way to encode a less animate agent is via some voicing and valency shenanigans. Maybe the speakers of our language will encode a third-person agent with a passive construction, putting the third-person argument in an instrumental case. Perhaps the instrumental case over time evolves into an ergative case and will snap back to the default SOV word order. And since we said that first and second person pronouns are more likely to be agents, maybe all first and second person patients will require the accusative case to confirm that there really is a third-person agent opposed to the expected third-person patient. Now, if we zoom out a little, we can see that all first and second-person pronouns will follow an accusative pattern, highlighted in blue, while all third-person arguments will follow an ergative pattern, highlighted in red. This also works neatly when we have mixed sentences, with both a first or second person pronoun and a third person noun. We can see that just the first and second person pronouns will follow the accusative pattern, and just the third person nouns will follow ergative patterns. Now, let's make an animacy split system. Let's say that first, second, and third person animate nouns and pronouns will be treated accusatively, while all third-person inanimate nouns will be treated ergatively. Maybe, like in our previous examples, in the proto-language, our speakers will devise some form of accusative case or direct object marking. But what if we had a sentence with an inanimate patient? Well, what if in a similar case to last time, our speakers become used to animate nouns being agents? In this case, we may not need the accusative case at all for inanimate patients, especially since inanimate nouns are less likely to be actively performing actions and are more likely to be patients. If I gave you the words man, rock, and sea and asked you to put together a sentence, you would most likely think of the man sees the rock and not the other way around. We see a similar sort of phenomenon in Spanish, where All animate patients are overtly marked with an accusative case, while inanimate patients receive no extra marking because they are more likely to be inferred as patients. Now, what if we wanted to code an inanimate agent? Well, again, we might be tempted to just place it before the patient, but remember, inanimate nouns are often analyzed and seen as patients, so this construction may be considered incorrect. And like in the case of Navajo, many of our language's speakers will probably try to avoid putting a less animate noun before a more animate noun. Maybe to solve this problem, our speakers use a passive construction, flipping around the word order and marking the inanimate agent in the instrumental case. Now we have the sentence, "The man was hit by the rock," opposed to "the rock hit the man," putting the animate noun first. Again, maybe as time passes, our speakers start worrying less about animacy in the syntax, and the instrumental case may evolve into a standard ergative case, and the word order will snap back to the default SOV word order. And again, maybe we still have to mark all animate patients with the accusative case to assure that the inanimate noun is really the agent. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, we can see that all of our animate nouns are treated accusatively, highlighted in blue, while all of our inanimate nouns are treated ergatively, highlighted in red. Again, this also applies in situations where there is one animate argument and one inanimate argument in a clause. Just the inanimate nouns are treated ergatively, and just the animate nouns are treated accusatively. Voila! Person animacy based split ergativity. Split intransitive systems. Languages with these systems will treat the subject of an intransitive clause more like an agent or more like a patient depending on the verb's semantic properties. Languages with these systems will usually have their subjects split on volition, state, initiation, whether or not the subject was affected, and a whole other grab bag of semantic factors. Soros has proposed a split intransitivity hierarchy to show which types of verbs are more likely to be treated unergatively, which means that the subject is more like an agent, or unaccusatively, which means the subject is more like a patient. On the left side of the spectrum, we see that change of location verbs like to fall, change of state verbs like to die, and state verbs like to be are more likely to be treated unaccusatively, while uncontrolled processes like to slip, controlled motional processes like to swim, and controlled non-motional processes like to work are treated unergatively. In other words, subjects of change of location, change of state, and state verbs are often treated more like a patient, while subjects of uncontrolled processes, controlled motional processes, and controlled non-motional process verbs are more likely to be treated like agents. Some languages, like Basque, will follow this hierarchy very neatly and precisely, while others, like Georgian, may follow this hierarchy more loosely and will deviate from it more. No language will follow this hierarchy perfectly, and there will always be little exceptions and deviations from the system, but most languages with these systems will follow it to some degree. Now, let's look at some examples. In this Basque example, we have two intransitive sentences. We can see that the subject of the verb to study takes an ergative subject, since to study is a controlled process verb, while the verb to die takes an absolutive subject, since it is a change of state verb. In Georgian, we see a similar phenomenon. Georgian displays these split intransitive patterns in the aorist or verb paradigm, so in some ways, Georgian has two ergative splits. How cool is that? Anyways, the controlled process verb to sow takes an ergative subject, while the verb to grow up takes an absolutive subject, since it is a change of state verb. Many of the Pomoan Languages of California exhibit similar systems, but in a slightly different way. The Pomoan languages in their truest sense do not display ergativity, but they do have unaccusative tendencies. For an example, in Northern Pomo, there is a class of intransitive verbs that take a subject in the nominative or agent form of the pronoun, like to walk or swim, since these actions are more often than not actions that are actively and intentionally performed by the subject. However, there is another class of intransitive verbs whose subject takes the accusative or patient pronoun form. Some examples are to faint or to bleed, since these actions are not intentional or volitional and are often very passive. In other words, you can think of these verbs in the way that the action is happening to the subject, opposed to the subject is actively performing the action. Interestingly, there are some verbs that can take either the nominative or accusative forms of the subject. Using a nominative subject for the verb to slide shows that it was an intentional action, conveying the meaning of to slide on purpose, while using an accusative subject shows that the sliding was accidental and was not voluntary, conveying the meaning of roughly to slip by accident. So you may be asking, how can this evolve in a Conlang? Well, sadly, I don't have too much to say about these systems, especially as a lot of it depends on the culture and semantics of a given language. From a grammatical perspective, perhaps a transitive verb's meaning would slowly bleach and change over time and would reanalyze the patient as the agent or subject. This will likely happen with verbs of sensation and internal experience. This is actually kind of what happened with the me gusta construction in Spanish, where the verb gustar, which meant to be pleasing, changed to like, resulting in the subject being marked in the object form. In your Conlang, try to roughly follow Soras's split intransitivity hierarchy and think of which categories of verbs will have a patient-like subject or an agent-like subject. And remember that there will always be little exceptions here and there within a given language. I will link some further reading down in the description for more information on how these systems work in real-world languages. In Part 3, we will be discussing syntactic ergativity, ergative verb agreement, the antipassive voice, syntactic pivot, and A-bar extraction. If you enjoyed and learned something new in this video, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this video with a friend. Please dislike the video and write a comment in the comment section if you have any constructive criticisms or suggestions for advice. Now, thank you so much, have a wonderful day, and toodaloo!